It's true I was a camper at Candelore between 1963 and 1969, in the golden days of Candelore, and in Kirk's own words, the golden days of the charismatic camp director. And Kirk Wipper was nothing if not a charismatic camp director, especially to a 9-year-old lad on his first adventure away from home. There are two memories I want to share today, not because they're unique to me. On the contrary, they're the same memories that everybody had who was at camp with Kirk, and have been touched on, actually, already today. But they exemplify the values that Kirk tried to instill in his campers. Values which, despite ourselves, seem to linger in our subconscious minds, only to niggle at us at the most inopportune times. The first memory is a scene that played itself out at countless flag raisings, as some cabin group was getting set to begin a canoe trip. The campers were called out of the circle, made to shake Kirk's immense hand, firmly, of course, look straight into his piercing and twinkling eyes, how confusing was that, and hear Kirk say in his best grave voice, "Good luck, men." And damn if we didn't feel like men, setting off on some important voyage of discovery. The second scene is in the dining hall, breakfast, the day after sleep out. I think I'm a senior then, maybe an explorer, doesn't matter. The night before was miserable, hot, muggy, rainy, buggy, and we were to have slept on Ghost. Only we didn't. We came back, as did some other cabin groups. Well, at breakfast, Kirk came slowly forward, gave us the look, you know the one, the hurt Kirk look, and said simply, "All together now, any camper can camp in the sun, but it takes a real camper to camp in the rain." The messages were clear. There were responsibilities. One was expected to master skills, to be one's best, to reach far and high, and to feel the import of the moment, and to avoid the easy road with all of its missed opportunities. Heady stuff indeed for a young lad. But that was Candelore, and that was Kirk. And I have to say, I'm better for both. Thank you, Kirk. It was an honor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to give some reflections on Kirk's. These are 3 inspirational isms which I wanted to talk about. Number 1, "Oh no, boys." This was first said by Kirk, according to John Adams, in a 1963 Nor'wester canoe trip in Quetico, which included John, Kirk, and Bob Anderson. And the group had just finished this one long, hard, buggy, just brutal portage. From my tripping days, it reminds me of Dixon Bonfield, but apparently worse. Bob finished first. He walked right into the lake, threw off his canoe, and, well, you know the rest. Kirk was next to emerge, took one look, and uttered his famous line, "Oh no, boys." But the inspirational part is that is about as stern as Kirk ever got. He was always forgiving, always saw the best in people, and he loved us, whatever we did. Is that not the greatest commandment? Thanks for the early reference to Christianity. I think so. I did look this up from John. Keep the commandments, especially love. Anyone who loves his brother remains in light. The second Kirkism. The strongest pines are those which face the strongest winds. This inspires perseverance to me. Picture the windswept, old-growth white pines high up in the Couchag Portage, the Couchag Outlook, probably 150 years old. These pines survive nearby logging and fires, disease, insects, scorching sun, freezing sleet, and always the wind. In life, we face all sorts of adversity. But Kirk's quote reminds us that these are simply parts of life, like the pines. We will endure and become stronger persons through them. And finally, count your blessings twice a day. To me, inspires purpose. It's a little-known quote of Kirk's. John Adams actually never heard of it. I only heard him say it once, in the context of his humble roots in rural Manitoba. And I actually asked Anne if it was indeed one of his favorites, which I'd heard, and she said it was. But Kirk added twice a day for emphasis. But what it means to me is this. Our blessings are gifts from God. In turn, what we do with them is our gift back to God. In that sense, the quote reminds us of how fortunate we are in our life. It reminds us to whom we do owe our many blessings. And it reminds us to ask, what are we doing with them? Sounds to me like the purpose of life itself. Now that is inspirational. In closing, I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I thank Kirk for his inspiration for all of us in countless ways, not just these few. Kirk, your inspiration to us will live on.
Thank you, James, for that painfully honest introduction. I'm here to tell a story, and I will be brief. And I'm here representing all campers from a certain era. So this story is from 1964, 1965. I don't really remember when, but that's more than 40 years ago. But I guess the bigger point is, why do I remember it? And that really is why we're all here today. So this was back, just so I can paint the picture, back in the mid-60s. This was the era of beetle boats at Camp Candelar, and I hope there are several in the Canoe Museum, beetle boats. It's an era of war canoes. It's an era of Speedo bathing suits, so that puts it in perspective. And I was rooting around in some of my old camp stuff, and there's a nice picture in here of John Hondrick, the former publisher of the Toronto Star, in a Speedo bathing suit. So if anybody wants to see that after, I could probably sell copies or put it on Facebook or something. Anyway, we used to do games at Candelar, and we'd have these things called wide games. And the one that I'm going to make reference to is a game called Douse the Fire. And basically, this predates greenhouse gas emissions or cap and trade or any of this stuff. Basically, what you did was at two ends of the senior section, you build as big a blaze as you could. And one team had to sneak up on the other team and put the fire out. So if you were offensively minded, the only implement you could possibly use was rubber boots. Nobody brought condoms to Candelar or anything like that, but only rubber boots would be the implement of carrying water. And if you were defensively minded, you would string your ground sheet around this fire so nobody could get in there. Well, I'm a 13-year-old boy. I'm about 4'4". I'm a little kid. I'm not strong or anything like that, but I think I love these games. Kirk taught us to love these games. So what I did is I ran down to the center of camp and stole, this is with reference to Jim's introduction, I stole a fire extinguisher. Now these fire extinguishers were these big things you carried on a backpack. It was a tank, and it had one of these devices where you could fire the water great distances and you could adjust the nozzle to get the type of spray you needed. So what I did is I ran down to camp, put this thing on my back, came back to the South Shore, filled it up with water, and then snuck along the edge of the lake with this thing on my back. And because I knew where this fire was, because I could see this barricade of ground sheets, and I started plunging this water, looping it up and over these barricades. And these guys were looking around, they'd hear this pss, pss, as the water would hit the flames, and they'd say, "What's going on here? How come our fire's going? It must be raining." So I kept plunging like this, looping the water up and over this barricade of ground sheets. And eventually, these guys got wind of it, and they just attacked me. And anyway, the bigger part to this, of course, is that I was told by the senior section director to go down to the center of camp and talk to Kirk. Because I had stolen a, whatever it was, Fire extinguisher, thank you. So now, here I am, this 13-year-old boy, going down to see Kirk, the camp director, with this massive hand and this persona, and I have to tell him what I've done. And so I said to Kirk, well, Kirk, we were playing douse the fire, and I stole this fire extinguisher from the center of camp, and yuck. Anyway, Kirk looked at me, and his first comments were, "Oh no, Johnny." Now, that was sort of like, "Oh no, boys," but in the first person, "Oh no, Johnny." And so I'm just petrified. And but we had a very gentle and honest and sympathetic discussion. It lasted about 30 seconds. And I really know that Kirk was proud of what I did. He had a way with being just beyond the rules. And he had a way to support individual problem solving. And I don't know, as a parent, but I felt his dealing with me was understanding. I thought it kept things in perspective. It was very caring, and it was fun. And would that we could all be like that. Thank you.
As Jim says, I now teach public administration. But I think everything I know about management, I learned from Kirk, and I learned it on the job. Anecdotes. I've never forgotten a day after I was at one of the canoe instructor schools run by CRCA. I was standing on the bridge at Buttermilk Falls, running a whitewater training session for a group of kids who would be going on a canoe trip. And I was with my bellow around my neck. I had a little more hair in those days, some of it went down my back. And Cease Irwin came along, and I knew Cease, because I was part of the senior staff group at Candelore, and Cease had been a great camp director, then retired. And he stopped, and as politely as Cease could, he basically said, "Is Kirk out of his mind?" Because there was this weird guy with a bunch of other people's children in the wash below this dam, dumping their canoes purposely and falling into the water. And I said, "Well, I'm here." I pointed out the guys spotting on each shore. There's 2 canoes out below, ready to pick them up. I said, "It's all fine." "And does Kirk know I'm here today?" "Well, not exactly, but he knows what I'm doing, and it's fine." And then, around that time, I stopped out from school, and not from camp, but I stopped out from school, and I was traveling and hitchhiking, and I got picked up by a guy somewhat older than me. And we got to talking, and he wanted to know what I did, and I explained about my role in the senior staff at a summer camp. And he couldn't believe it. I was 21 at the time. And for him, this guy who worked in important organizations, the hierarchy at Candelore was unbelievably flat. He just couldn't understand how over 100 staff and over 200 of other people's kids could have such a flat hierarchy. Well, you've all heard today why that would be. Whether you were a junior camper or the most important person on the staff, you had a personal relationship with Kirk. And you worked for Kirk, and somehow that worked. So putting that in terms of modern administration theory, why does that work? Well, it's about accountability. And with Kirk, we were all accountable to the striped maples. We knew that. We were accountable to the parents of the children in our charge, that they'd go home again. We were accountable that those kids had a good time every day. So we were accountable to Kirk for all of that. But equally, we were all accountable to ourselves. We knew that. But even more, and Rod McDonald, who's on next, would call this the old guard. Many of you remember being told about the old guard. The old guard didn't depend on your position. Depended on who you were and what you did. In other words, it depended on our accountability to each other to deliver the kind of experience at Candelore that everybody who came there expected. And I wish I could teach my students how to run organizations like that. I wish I could teach some of my colleagues how to live in organizations like that. From that standpoint, I think Kirk was an organizational and a managerial genius, and I wish I knew how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I'm very grateful, more grateful than you could possibly know, to have the chance to be here today and join in the celebration. I first met Kirk in the spring of 57 or 58 was. My brother Craig and I were racing blocks of wood in the spring runoff channeled by the gutter in front of our house in suburban Toronto. Kirk had come to show Keith Cleverton's film Dear Mom to my parents in the hope that they'd sign us up for the coming summer. And after what turned out to be a successful visit, Kirk spoke briefly to the two of us when he was leaving, using for the first time to our ears one of his cherished expressions, "Keep up the good work, old moose." And for the next 17 summers that I spent at Candelore, scarcely a week went by when I did not hear the encouragement of being called Old Moose by Kirk. Over 8 seasons as a camper and 9 on staff, I was blessed to encounter the many sides of Kirk that we are celebrating this afternoon. And I'd like to recount a few summer camp moments and related Kirkisms that I believe speak eloquently to who he was. In my final year as a camper in 1964, I was able to complete the requirements for the master canoeist under the tutelage of Robin Campbell. And part of that rite of passage was an afternoon with Kirk exploring the relics resting on the rafters of the dining hall, the original Canoe Museum. I remember Kirk recounting his dream to establish a real canoe museum behind Lynx Hall, a project to which I and many others in this room had occasion to contribute physical labor over the next several years. After the tour, Kirk took me down to Chapel Point for a brief chat. As we looked out to Chapel Island, he said wistfully, "You know, Rod, you are now part of the old guard." Now, at age 16, I had little understanding of all that expression entailed. But from then on, whenever I heard Kirk refer to the old guard, I would think about how he set impossible challenges for himself and his staff. Always impossible, and yet always met. Much later, I came to realize that to be a member of the old guard meant facing up to challenges, both material and spiritual, and faithfully but quietly carrying the torch of aspiration in the service of ideas greater than oneself. Fast forward 5 years. In late August of 1969, it was found that 3 intermediate section counselors had been drinking alcohol in their cabin. Big East, Jim, where's Jake Follis? A decision was taken to send them home on the Algar Express, even though there were only 4 or 5 days left in the summer. 2 days later, however, Kirk changed his mind, and over the opposition of the entire senior staff, of which I was one at the time, permitted 2 of the 3 to return to camp to finish the summer. When pressed about this decision, he replied with a quiver in his voice and moist eyes, "Well, men, you will understand this when you're fathers yourself." And by that time, I knew that whenever Kirk said men, he was directly appealing to the noblest virtues of his staff. Now, a few summers after that, I had occasion to feel the pain and embarrassment of being the target of another of Kirk's characteristic expressions, namely, boys. This often came out in the phrase we've heard, "Oh no, boys," to draw our attention to some act or omission when we had let him down. In the summer of 1973, Kirk was obliged to spend considerable time away from camp attending to personal medical issues. And in his absence as assistant director, Candelore, it fell to me to look after the day-to-day operation of the camp. I did the best I could, but often let little things, where is she? like having the entire crew of CITs compete to move pop bottles for Joanna, who was running the tuck shop that summer, distort my judgment. When Kirk returned from his last round of treatment, he took me over to Chapel Island for an old boys talk and quietly explained that it was inappropriate for me to let my frustration with him color my responsibilities to others, especially Joanna. From his eyes and tone of voice, I could see that my treatment of Joanna had hurt him deeply. I offered him my resignation, but he simply replied, "Let's just put this behind us and get back to work, old moose." My final remembrance goes back to pre-camp of 1970. Joe Sharon, a first-year staff member, and I were in the dining hall well after midnight one day when Kirk had been in Toronto. We were playing contemporary folk songs on piano and guitar, as we often did in the evenings. And we had just finished one song when Kirk, having arrived unannounced from Toronto, walked through the kitchen door into the dining hall with tears in his eyes. And it's the only time I ever saw Kirk actually crying. He had listened to the whole song we were playing, and as he left, he said, "Men, it's time to turn in, but don't ever, ever forget that song." I played the song only one other time in his presence, when I came to say goodbye in the evening of August 26, 1974, the last night of my last summer. Wow. It has been of my last summer at Camp Candelor. The song counseled humility about our own success and compassion for those less fortunate. Twin themes that captured so much of who Kirk was. Kirk knew that I was intending to embark on a career as a law professor, and when my performance ended, he softly said, "Rod, you'll always be part of my old guard. But as you get older, you will learn that you should not spend your time chasing personal rewards and recognition. The real measure of your impact lies in the way those who you have taught choose to live their lives after you're gone." I last saw Kirk a couple of years ago at the memorial for John Thomas. As he was leaving to attend another function, he said to me, just as he had said to my brother and me 50 years earlier, "Keep up the good work, old moose." But he added this time, "And don't forget the song you played for me on your final day."